This is a re-upload of a video I already made. I'm doing this because the audio in those first few videos wasn't very good.
We're on to FNaF 3 now, and things surprisingly get a lot simpler. For starters, this game only has one real animatronic, and has one less night compared to the previous games. This will certainly be a breeze. Why am I typing numbers into the wall? Why? I'll start off by once again laying out our sources for lore in this game. Once again, we have Phone Guy, who this time is taking up on a primarily lore-based role, as opposed to being a tutorial unit. Next, this is normally when I'd say we have Easter eggs, but there really aren't any in this game that add any new information, not counting the minigames, of course. Following this, we have the ever-present environmental clues, and finally, we have the minigames, this time split into two types. First, we have the end of night minigames that you have to play through, and in the second group we have the secret minigames which lead to the game's good ending. Before we go on to the lore revealed in-game, this is the first instance of there being exclusive lore from an external source, namely the game's description on Steam. All that's important to note here is that FNaF 3's location is an attraction called Fazbear's Frights, which is said to be open 30 years after the pizzeria chain closed its doors. If we were right in nailing 1993 as the year FNaF 1 shut down, that means FNaF 3 takes place in 2023. That's the current year now, but when this game came out, that would have been the future, which is weird to think about. Starting off with Phone Guy's lore, there's actually two Phone Guys in this game. First we meet Phone Dude, who is primarily a tutorial character, until Phone Guy returns, though as pre-recorded messages from years past given, he's dead. The Phone Dude lore is as follows. Fazbear Frights is using authentic relics from past Freddy's locations to make the attraction as historic as possible. They haven't found any functional animatronics as of Night 1. Though as of Night 2, after following a lead from someone who apparently worked on the past buildings, who said there are secret rooms on the back of each restaurant, the organization discovers an old decrepit suit, Springtrap. The Phone Guy lore looks more to the past, including the following information. There are two animatronics that existed at past locations that are known as Springlock suits. These suits are attracted to noise, and more notably, can double as both animatronic and wearable costume, so as to not break customer immersion. This technology is very volatile, however, with the slightest bit of moisture or heat being enough to cause the spring locks to come undone, which has disastrous consequences for the person inside. The location these suits were used at was still referred to as Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Each Freddy's had a built-in safe room that was invisible to animatronics, camera systems, or security systems. There was an incident at a location which involved simultaneous springlock failures, which ultimately led to the springlock suits being retired. In the meantime, temporary non-thematic costumes were put into place. Even after the suit's retirement, the safe rooms remained open as a storage room for some time. There was an unspecified incident of customers being brought into the safe room, leading to a PSA from the company to not do that. The Spring Bonnie animatronic was noticeably moved again under nebulous circumstances. The safe rooms were abruptly boarded up one day due to federal restrictions, leading to anything that was once in them being trapped inside. Moving on to environmental clues, there are some key, often neglected details I want to point out here. More obviously, all of the toy animatronics' husks are present, with their endoskeletons noticeably missing. This aligns with the plot point of them being scrapped after FNaF 2. Less obviously, while the FNaF animatronics can be seen around the building, the suits do not have their endoskeletons either, just being the costumes themselves. Phantom animatronics appear, but they're just that, phantoms. It may be notable that while each Phantom resembles the FNaF 2 counterpart, Chica resembles her FNaF 1 version. Also, Phantom Freddy specifically resembles Golden Freddy from FNaF 2. When the Phantom puppet appears, it is when the real puppet appears on one of the cameras, even having a reflection in the floor. Sometimes a shadowy Golden Freddy-looking figure can appear in the office. It ultimately does nothing, though. A tangible Golden Freddy suit is not seen in this location. At the end of the week, we see a newspaper that Fazbear Frights has burned down, with Springtrap being seen in the background when you brighten the image. Onto the minigames, I first want to get the secret minigames out of the way. Namely because the scenes in them mostly don't seem relevant. Rather, the main goal of them does, with some exceptions. Mango's minigame involves collecting a cake, which is used in the other minigames. The other minigames involve characters taking cake to dead children. This culminates in the Happiest Day minigame where the 5 children, plus the puppet, come together and their souls are presumably put to rest. This leads to the game's good ending, where the souls are set free from the classic animatronics. It's worth noting that the 5 other children, wearing totally unfamiliar masks, are at this party too. Other than that, only notable parts of these minigames are the following. A level called Stage 01, where a stage only occupying Golden Freddy and Golden Bonnie are seen. The final secret minigame before Happiest Day, where you play as Shadow Bonnie from FNaF 2, warping between all the previous levels to give cake to a child. Before we get to the timeline, I'll finally cover the end of night minigames, and their relevance to the story. Each minigame is simple in its premise. You play as one of the 4 FNaF 1 animatronics in a location identical to the first game in its layout. Shadow Freddy guides you to the back room of the location, and each time you get dismantled by the purple guy. There are also clues to the previously mentioned minigames, though those aren't all too significant lore-wise. It's worth noting that when it comes time to play as Foxy, he has his full costume on. That is, he isn't destroyed until the purple guy catches him. In the final minigame, you play as one of the 5 dead children, with the other 4 watching on as you scare the purple guy in the back room. He puts his Spring Bonnie suit on to hide, but it malfunctions, causing him to bleed out. So that's really it. Noticeably less than FNaF 2, but keep in mind, this game was originally supposed to be a wrap of the series, so it makes sense. So let's go back to our timeline. I'll be signifying all FNaF 3 events with the color green. It's worth noting this game has 2 endings, one being the ending that shows the animatronic masks no longer lit up, and another where they are still lit, being the good and bad endings respectively. Well, I know Scott Cawthon said that
very interesting.
Okay.
The answer is very interesting. The answer is complex.
that was well after the game came out, and this series aims to update the timeline based on the intentions of when the game released. So given this was once supposed to be the final game in the timeline, I'm marking down the good ending as the true ending. However, that will change soon enough. So what new information can we add to the timeline? Well, firstly, I want to add details relating to Springlock suits. We know that at the FNaF 2 location, the Springlocks were considered spare suits, but given Phone Guy says the Springlocks were active at a Freddy's location, I think that tells us that the pre-FNaF 2 Freddy's, plus the elusive Fredbear's Family Diner, likely hosted to the Springlock suits as official characters. This is supported by the fact that Stage 01 only features 2 animatronics, Golden Freddy and Spring Bonnie, which also seems to imply that Golden Freddy was once known as Fredbear at some point. We can also add to the timeline that, probably at the location before FNaF 2, the Springlock animatronics are retired after an incident involving multiple simultaneous Springlock failures. The reason why I'm coming to this conclusion is the fact that the Springlock animatronics aren't used at the FNaF 2 location. If anything, they're only used for parts. It's important to keep in mind as of FNaF 2, what we can assume to be the yellow Springlock animatronics restored in parts and service, not a boarded up safe room. However, keep in mind Phone Guy never says that the Springlock suits are necessarily to be stored in the safe rooms. Instead, he says they are to be sent to a remote location while being looked at by technicians. Nothing really seems to come of this, but we know somehow Spring Bonnie is put into the FNaF 1 safe room at some point, long before it gets boarded up. Here's where things get confusing. It's mentioned that the Spring Bonnie animatronic was moved at one point, and customers were likely brought back into the safe room. The implication here, of course, being that this incident is when Purple Guy wore the Spring Bonnie suit and lured kids into the back room. This would mean, of course, from how we understand the timeline as it is, that would have taken place at the pre-FNaF 2 Freddy's. However, in the next call, we learn that the back rooms are being boarded up. As stated, the end of night minigames show that the Purple Guy got springlocked before the back rooms were boarded up. However, we know that he had to be present around the time of FNaF 2 to do the second string of murders. So is it just possible that I was wrong and the original MCI actually took place at the FNaF 1 Freddy's? Well, the problem with this would be the clues in FNaF 2, that the MCI already took place, namely that the old animatronics had a bad smell to them, and also that people have had negative impressions of the company for some reason. Plus, and most damning, the Save Them minigame clearly shows Golden Freddy and Withered Freddy moving around the building, so what's going on here? I think this is simply a case of poor communication in the storytelling. Something not unheard of course, in the series. I think the simple solution is that the MCI is correctly placed on our timeline. It's just that there is a time jump between the Night 5 and Night 6 calls. There isn't really indication in the Night 6 call that this can't work, so I'm sticking with this explanation. It is also possible that nothing actually ever came of the Spring Bonnie suit being moved or customers being brought back into the safe room, but I don't know why they'd mention it if it wasn't important. With that mess untangled, we can continue adding to the timeline. We can add a detail to the first MCI that the mascot suit used to lure the children was the Spring Bonnie suit. We can go on to resolve an issue I had with the second MCI, and that's implied in this game that the 5 children who died at the FNaF 2 Freddy's really didn't latch on to any of the animatronics at that point. Looking at Happiest Day again, before we get to the table with the original 5 children, we pass 5 other children wearing the masks of unseen characters. I think the implication here is just like how the puppet was involved with connecting the original 5 children, or at least 4 of them, to the main animatronics. Once the FNaF 2 bots were scrapped, the puppet was left to find other, potentially irrelevant costumes to attach the MCI 2 kids to. Perhaps even the same costumes that the Springlocks were replaced with. Speaking of, we know around this time the puppet must escape the FNaF 2 location somehow, and likely begins roaming around. That aside, we can move on to what I've been waiting to reveal since episode 1 of the series, the incident that put Foxy out of order. Once again, note that the minigame post Night 4 shows that at this point, Foxy isn't damaged. That doesn't last long though, as the purple guy tears him to pieces. This shows to us that before FNaF 1, Purple Guy becomes Springtrap, and thus gets boarded up in the secret back room, the room off camera in FNaF 1. Just as a reminder, Foxy has no spare parts in the back room, potentially explaining why they weren't able to repair him, but could repair the other animatronics. Sometime following this and the closure of FNaF 1, the classic animatronics are presumably scrapped, with their endoskeletons being lost to time, and only their external costumes remaining. Moving past FNaF 1, we skip all the way to the year 2023 when the Fazbear Frights attraction opens. Shortly after the purple guy, aka Springtrap, is recovered from the safe room from the FNaF 1 pizzeria. We also know at some point during this week, the puppet decides to pop into the building now and then for whatever reason. Not too long after this, Fazbear Frights is burned down, an event that I believe to be, at this point in time, represented metaphorically as the happiest day, where all the children's souls are finally freed from the costumes and put to rest. I guess a contradiction to this fact is that the other 5 souls, represented by unfamiliar animal masks, are present at the party, though their masks aren't found anywhere in Fazbear Frights. But keep in mind, we never see any of them disappear, as they're all off screen when the final cake is placed, so who knows? It could still be possible that since Fazbear Frights never discovered this mystery mascot costumes, those souls were never put to rest. But as a whole, that's where our timeline leaves off, at our first pose down to the series. I do want to leave off on a distinction, however, that as of now, it appears as if the souls become attached to costumes, namely the masks, not the endoskeletons. This bit of information is delivered from the ending screens, where the disembodied masks are seen. So, what questions remain? Not many, really. I suppose we don't have solid confirmation as to what happened to the second set of MCI kids, but it could always be possible that the happiest day is meant to show that given they all have their masks on, and look more lively, they've been set free already, and for a long time. But it also isn't ruled out that they've simply been forgotten about, both in the in-game universe and also by Scott Cawthon himself. There's also the Shadow animatronics, but given we know that there's an incident involving simultaneous spring-lock failures, I think this clues us in that Shadow Bonnie and Freddy are the souls of workers who died in Spring Bonnie and Spring Freddy, respectively, in these incidents. Also, we never find out who did the bite of 87. There's also Springtrap, who's still on the loose, but that's less than an unresolved thing and more so to give a little bit of a kick to the supposed ending. The only thing I think is truly unresolved at this point is the question of what the Phantoms actually are. And unfortunately, friends, this is the first time I have to put a point onto the book scoreboard on the account that, yeah, we never get a clear answer to this in the games. However, in Fazbear Fright's story, What We Found, it's heavily implied that their hallucinations are directly caused by agony leeching off of Springtrap. So, yeah, there's that. But there you have it, the original trilogy of FNaF done and dusted. While I am partially relieved to have this section of the timeline wrapped up, I know it's coming.